Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk about the J.L. Mackie on the problem of evil. In our last class, we introduced this problem of evil, the question of why does God allow suffering. And today we are going to look at a much more, and we saw Dostoevsky's treatment of that in an informal way. It's just two brothers having a conversation in his novel. They bring up some very important, obviously, and deep philosophical issues, though, but they don't spell them out in any sort of logical, rigorous detail, and that's what we're going to see today. Mackie thinks that if you look into this problem of evil, if you actually sort of track the logical implications of it, what you come to realize is that the problem of evil proves that the God of the Bible could not possibly exist, given the suffering there is in the world. I want to make a disclaimer at the beginning of this, just a warning. I know this is a very personal issue for a lot of people. What's more personal than your religious faith, right? So I want to warn everybody, we are, I'm not here to proselytize. I'm not here to convince anybody to be on one side or another, but we are going to treat the claim that God exists like we treat any other claim in a philosophy class. We're going to look into what the implications of it are and whether or not it's plausible, right, from a philosophical perspective. Furthermore, today is going to belong to the atheist, J.L. Mackie, but he's not going to get the last word. The last philosopher we're going to read in this section and in the course is Richard Swinburne, who is going to argue from a Christian perspective that Mackie is wrong. So, okay. Before we go any further, let's get some terminology out of the way. Now is a great time to write some of this stuff down. In fact, go ahead and write all of this down. Here are some terms you're going to need to know. First of all, I'm going to use the word theist. And theist is going to be my catch-all for expression for a believer in the monotheistic God. This includes the God of the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran. Not necessarily limited to that. There maybe are some other religions around the world that also propose a monotheistic God. But for what we're going to talk about here today, theist is going to capture all of those people. Anybody who believes in that monotheistic God. And we'll go into a little more detail about what it means to believe, what that God is like in a second. So for the purpose of our conversation, I said this last time, that evil, we're going to use the term evil and suffering interchangeably. I realize that evil has some religious implications that maybe are different than suffering, and this is should be called the problem of suffering, but it isn't. It's called the problem of evil. So make the proper adjustments. Furthermore, and this is an important one, because Swinburne in the next article is going to make extensive use of this word. And this might not show up in a typical dictionary. It's the word theodicy. And this is an attempt to resolve the problem of evil. The problem of evil, of course, then, is the question of, well, why does God allow suffering? And if you try to resolve that problem, if you try to answer that question, you're presenting some form of a theodicy, right? Yes, that's just a philosopher's term, but make sure you know it, because Swinburne especially is going to make use of it, and I'm going to make use of it for today. So, okay. So next, let's talk about not just the problem of evil. We've talked about that in a little, to some degree so far. But let's talk about a different version of the problem of evil, the version that Mackie presents for today, and that's called the logical problem of evil. So make sure you distinguish in your mind. And by your mind, I mean your notes, the difference between the problem of evil, the informal problem of evil, and the logical problem of evil, okay? It's the logical problem of evil we're going to talk about today. So, what's that? Good question. Oh, no? Okay. Okay, so here is the logical problem of evil. So, the logical problem of evil is as follows. Mackie says, well, the theists believe three things, that and they hold three common and essential views about God and the world. that Mackie says when you take these three all together, they produce a contradiction. So these beliefs are that, one, that God is all-powerful. That is, that God is able, well, we'll talk about these. Let's go through them real quick, and then we'll fill in some details. But let me lay it all out first, beginning top to bottom. So theists believe that God is all-powerful, that God is perfectly good, and yet that evil exists, right? And when you take all three of these together, Mackie says it produces this contradiction. And the contradiction is as follows. If God is all-powerful, then he must be able to stop evil. If he can't stop evil, then he's not all-powerful, right? If he is perfectly good, then he must want to stop evil. If he doesn't want to stop evil, then he's not perfectly good, is he? Yet evil exists. So if God is all-powerful, he can stop evil. If he's perfectly good, he must want to stop evil. Yet look around you. Evil and suffering exist, right? So let's fill in some details we need to fill in to get to this contradiction. First of all, let's talk about what we mean by all-powerful. Again, for the purpose of this conversation, there are some agreements kind of made about what this means in this context. So for our purposes here, we're just all going to agree that being all-powerful, if there were a being that is all-powerful, then that being should be able to do anything that can be imagined, right? Turn water into wine, make the earth spin backwards, create unicorns. These are all things that can be imagined, right? Now, some people have argued that, and other people have wondered if being all-powerful should include the power to do absolutely anything, including the logically impossible, like making a square circle, or make 2 + 2 = 5, or making a triangle with 4 sides, right? And this is an old debate in the philosophy of religion. There are different people on different sides of this, but I think at this point it's safe to say historically the minority have been the people who would say that God could do absolutely anything, even the logically impossible. One of those people, by the way, was René Descartes, right? He obviously could imagine God or even an evil genius who could make a square circle or 2 + 2 = 5, right? But the majority opinion over the years, even among believers in God, follow in the line of St. Thomas Aquinas, who thinks that, asking God to do the logically impossible is asking God to do nonsense, right? And logically impossible things are simply absurd, and so we can't imagine that, right? And we have to agree to this to make this get this conversation off the ground, because if God can even do the logically impossible, then trying to prove he doesn't exist for the logical argument is a waste of time, right? Secondly, God is perfectly good. Let's talk about what that means to get this. For the purposes of our argument here, what we need to be included among perfectly good. First of all, being perfectly good means that you're absolutely without flaw or shortcoming, that there is nothing you could do that would make you better, right? And Mackie points out that we take that to mean that you are trying to defeat, if you are a perfectly good being, then you would be trying to reduce the amount of evil there is in the world. That only seems reasonable. I mean, if we have two people, both who are perfectly without flaw, let's say they're perfectly morally good, one of them, though, was just sitting around playing video games all day. The other one is actively out there crusading to make the world a better place. Well, one of them is better than the other, right? They may be morally flawless, but one of them has proven to be more heroic than the other, let's say, right? So, so we take it that a God that is perfectly good, that could not be any better, would be one that is actively opposing evil and trying to make the world a better place, right? And yet, despite all of this, evil exists. Evil and suffering exist, right? And what do we want to say about number 3 here? Well, suffering here is going to include everything from the pain of stubbing your toe to the horrors of Auschwitz and the concentration camps. Furthermore, since we're just talking about evil as suffering and not just human action, we also mean the suffering that results from hurricanes and earthquakes and cancer and coronavirus and everything else, all the natural sources too, right? It seems to a lot of people, both religious and non-religious, that this argument raises at least a good question, right? I never insist, of course, as I said, I'm not trying to proselytize to anybody or change anybody's views on any of this. We're trying to be even-handed in all of this. I know a lot of my students are religious and have deeply held religious beliefs. So I don't expect anybody at this point to say, "Oh, wow, I no longer believe in God," right? But what I do expect if you are religious, if you do believe in God, at the very least, I would insist that you admit that this is a good question, right? This raises a good issue. So that isn't to say that there's no reasonable response that might defeat this, but at least admit this raises a good question. Okay, so Mackie, however, of course, is going to say that there is no reasonable reaction to this question. Well, no reasonable option open to the theist, right? Mackie says there are actually 3 ways to respond to this question, right? 3 broad categories. One of them is what he calls an adequate solution. Those will do, and the other ones are inadequate, right? So since I am down to 1 board, and I want to make reference to the moving parts of the logical problem of evil, I am not going to erase this now, but write this down. I'm going to walk you through the 3 categories of response to this problem. So you might want to write that down in your notes and then write this under. Right. The first category of response to this problem is what Mackie calls adequate solutions. Adequate solutions, as the name implies, they get the job done. And Mackie says it's easy to defeat this problem. It's easy to get rid of this. Pick at least one of those 3 beliefs and stop believing it. Throw it out. Right? Now, Mackie says that will defeat this problem. The problem is only generated if you take all 3 of these beliefs together. If you throw one of them out, he has, for the purposes of this conversation, no problem with your worldview. Your worldview might have other problems. Mackie, of course, was an atheist. He didn't believe that any beliefs in the supernatural or in God were reasonable. But for the purpose of this argument, the scope of it is limited to the theist. Now, if you throw out one of these 3 beliefs, you are outside of the mainstream tradition of theism. And Mackie says you no longer count as a theist. So, just as an example, Buddhists in Buddhism take it that the fact of suffering, the fact that evil exists, proves on the face of it that there could not possibly be the sort of God that is described in the Bible, a God that is perfectly good and all-powerful. And Buddhism just takes it from there. They just take it with rejecting the idea of this all-powerful God, and they just go on from there. And in fact, their entire worldview is based on the trying to overcome suffering. Yes. One other example and there are other examples of non-theistic religions around the world, and we can sort of categorize them. We're going to put them in this framework. We can categorize them based on which of these 3 beliefs they reject, right? I already did Buddhism. I will stick a toe in Hinduism, although my understanding of Hinduism is that the Hindus are very, very inconsistent about their belief in an all-powerful, perfectly good God. That they sort of take it that that is not that exists, that can coincide with beliefs in lesser gods, and they actually have a whole really vast, complicated system of lesser gods that they believe in, right? And then there's maybe some inconsistency in Hinduism, but to this issue directly, they are likely to say that, well, the will of God ultimately is not played out in directly. It is played out through this pantheon of lesser gods, and so it's not like you pray to God to help you directly, right? One other religion you might have heard of and maybe don't have never really understood or looked into is Christian Science, right? This is an offshoot of Christianity that was founded by Mary Baker Eddy in the 19th century. Christian Science is not the same thing as Scientology. That's the religion created by L. Ron Hubbard that takes all of Tom Cruise's money. I'm talking now about Christian Science, or if you've driven around town, there are a few locations of Church of Christ Scientists, right? Well, Christian Scientists, and actually some fundamentalist Christian traditions, but Christian Science especially finds itself sometimes in the crosshairs of our law, because they have one belief in particular that puts them on the wrong side of the law often, and that is they reject most kinds of medicine. And so in Christian Science, if you get a headache, rather than take Tylenol, you pray to God to relieve your headache, right? And that's fine. It may be fine for you and a headache, but if your child needs dialysis because she has because she has kidney failure or something, then simply praying over her is going to be not enough. And if she dies, that you are likely to be brought up on charges for negligent homicide, which sometimes Christian Scientists find themselves in having a problem with. So you might have heard this, and if not, keep an eye out for it in the newspaper. It comes up once in a while, but lesser known is the specific beliefs that lead Christian Scientists to reject medicine. And Christian Scientists actually they reject medicine on the grounds that evil isn't real, that evil and suffering are not real. It's just an illusion, and that if we pray to God, He will remove the illusion that we are suffering. Right? Now, that view has a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties and seems unusual to a lot of people. I don't bring it up to pick on it, and if you're a Christian Scientist, I'm not trying to pick on you. There's actually they're well represented here in St. Louis. There's a pretty active movement. I'm not trying to pick on you. I'm just pointing. I'm actually quite the opposite. I'm pointing out that from Mackie's perspective, Christian science is way more plausible than mainstream Christianity. At least Christian Scientists, they might reject the idea that suffering exists, and that might strike us as an unusual or untenable belief. But from Mackie's perspective, at least they don't believe something that's demonstrably false, right? At least they don't believe something that is just, logically wackadoodle, right? Yeah, I'm not quoting him. Imagine wackadoodle with an Australian accent. I think that's how Mackie would describe theism. So anyway, so to sum up that, so the adequate solutions to this problem are to reject at least one of the three core theistic beliefs. Mackie, of course, takes it that most theists are not willing to do this, and instead what they do is they enter into one of the two other kinds of reactions that we might pose to the logical problem of evil, right? The second kind of reaction or response we might give to the logical problem of evil is what Mackie calls a half-hearted solution. A half-hearted solution, stay with me, a half-hearted solution is one that pretends to reject at least one of the three beliefs. So they say, okay, yeah, the logical problem of evil proves that at least one of these three things isn't true, right? But then elsewhere they act as though all three of them are true. Mackie doesn't spend a lot of time on this because this is a kind of underused sort of response, and he doesn't think it works. I mean, the name, he calls it half-hearted solution, so that should be a clue that he doesn't think it really works. He has some specific people in mind. He quotes Alexander Pope, also the St. Thomas, or not Aquinas, but Augustine, right? St. Augustine famously deployed an argument that meant to show that, in effect, that he doesn't really believe that evil exists, right? One of Augustine's analogies was to light and darkness, like the light, the source of heat and light. A source of heat and light is the real thing, and that there might be places in the room, like under the table or behind the door, where the light doesn't quite reach, and we call that darkness. But it isn't a real thing in the universe the way the light is. That darkness is really just a privation of light. It's just where the light doesn't get to, right? If that makes sense. And so ultimately, the metaphysically real thing in the universe would be God. And that what we call evil is just the places, the people or the things that have not yet turned towards God. They are turning away from God or not going along with God's program. But that doesn't represent a real metaphysical counterforce in the universe. It's just a turning away, right? Now, from Mackie's perspective, that's an example of the kind of thing that might work if Augustine were willing to apply that idea consistently throughout his religious writings. But Augustine and the Catholics, the later Christians and the Catholics, they don't. Elsewhere, they treat good and evil as though they are both real forces in the universe trying to wipe each other out, right? And if you're going to treat good and evil as real forces in the universe trying to wipe each other out, then it's not going to work to say that, oh, well, evil doesn't really exist, right? And I think Mackie's attitude is, well, that this idea that Augustine proposes that evil is just a privation of good, or just where God doesn't quite get to, or hasn't quite conquered or gotten to yet. That's really just a kind of, they really just believe that when they're confronted with this problem, that the rest of the time they just put that aside and go back to believing good versus evil, right? And that their religion would look very different if they actually consistently applied that view, right? So the most important kind of response, Mackie thinks, to this problem, or rather the most common response historically, has been of the third variety. So the first variety was adequate solutions, reject at least one of these three beliefs and do it consistently. The second kind of response would be what he calls a half-hearted solution, and that's where you pretend to reject at least one of these three views, but then elsewhere just act as though all three of them are true. So that doesn't work. It's half-hearted. It's inconsistent. And the third variety is what Mackie calls fallacious solutions, right? Fallacious solutions, the word there is fallacy. In logic, a fallacy is an error in logic or an error in thinking. Mackie thinks that a fallacious solution proposes to believe that if you're giving a fallacious solution, you pretend to believe all three of these, or you claim to believe all three of these beliefs. But elsewhere in your writing, you act as though one of them is not true, right? So it's kind of the inverse of the half-hearted solution. So now from there, Mackie says, so Mackie thinks that a number of these fallacious solutions turn out to be the most common theist responses to the problem of evil. So he thinks that he needs to walk us through why those most common fallacious solutions are in fact fallacious. And that's what he does with the rest of his article. He starts walking through, telling us why he thinks the different fallacious solutions are fallacious. So, pause.